This is the story of David's father, written by Robert Munsch and illustrated by Martchenko. Julie was skipping home from school, and she came to a large moving van. A man came out carrying a spoon, only it was as big as a shovel. Another man came out carrying a fork, only it was as big as a pitchfork. And a third man came out carrying a knife, only it was as big as a flagpole. "Yikes," said Julie. "I don't want to get to know these people at all." She ran all the way home and hid under her bed until dinner time. The next day, Julie was skipping home from school again. A boy was standing where the moving van had been, and he said, "Hi, my name's David. Would you like to come and play?" Julie looked at him very carefully. He seemed to be a regular sort of boy, so she stayed to play. At 5 o'clock, from far away down the street, someone called, "Julie, come and eat." "That's my mother," said Julie. And then someone called, "David." "That's my father," said David. Julie jumped up in the air, ran around in a circle 3 times, ran home and locked herself in her room till it was time for breakfast the next morning. The next day, Julie was skipping home and she saw David again. And he said, "Hi, Julie, do you want to come and play?" And Julie looked at him very, very carefully. He seemed to be a regular boy, so she stayed and played. And when it was almost 5 o'clock, David said, "Julie, please stay for dinner." But Julie remembered the big knife and the big fork and the big spoon. "Well, I don't know," she said. "Maybe it's a bad idea. I think maybe no. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye." "Well," said David, "we're having cheeseburgers, chocolate milkshakes, and a salad." "Oh," said Julie, "I love cheeseburgers. I'll stay. So they went into the kitchen, and there was a small table with cheeseburgers, milkshakes, and salads. And on the other side of the room, there was an enormous table. On it were a spoon as big as a shovel, a fork as big as a pitchfork, and a knife as big as a flagpole. "David," whispered Julie, who sits there?" "Oh," said David, "that's where my father sits. You can hear him coming now." And David's father sounded like this: "Broom, broom, broom."
And he opened the door, and David's father was a giant. And on his table were 26 snails, 3 fried octopuses, and 16 bricks covered with chocolate sauce.
David and Julie ate their cheeseburgers, and the father ate the snails. David and Julie drank their milkshakes, and the father ate the fried octopuses. David and Julie ate their salads, and the father ate his chocolate-covered bricks. David's father asked Julie if she would like a snail, and Julie said no. David's father asked Julie if she would like an octopus, and Julie said no. David's father asked Julie if she would like a delicious chocolate-covered brick, and Julie said, "No, but please, may I have another milkshake?" And so David's father made her another milkshake.
And when they were done, Julie said very softly, so the father couldn't hear, "David, you don't look very much like your father." "Well, I'm adopted," said David. "Oh," said Julie. "Well, do you like your father?" "He's great," said David. "Come for a walk and see." So they walked down the street. Julie and David skipped, and father went broom, broom, broom. And they came to a road they couldn't get across. The cars wouldn't stop for David. The cars wouldn't stop for Julie. The father walked into the middle of the road, looked at the cars, and yelled, "Stop!" And the cars all jumped into the air, ran around in a circle 3 times, went back up the street so fast they forgot their tires. Julie and David crossed the street and went into a store. And the man who ran the store didn't like serving kids. They waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And then David's father came in, and he looked at the storekeeper and said, "These kids are my friends." And the man jumped into the air, ran around the store 3 times, and gave David and Julie 3 boxes of ice cream, 11 bags of potato chips, and 19 lifesavers, all for free. Julie and David walked down the street and went around a bend. There were 6 big kids from grade 8 standing in the middle of the sidewalk, and they looked at David, and they looked at Julie, and they looked at the food. Then one big kid reached down and grabbed the box of ice cream. David's father came around the bend, and he looked at those big kids, and he yelled, "Beat it." And they jumped right out of their shirts, they jumped right out of their pants, they ran down the street in their underwear, and Julie ran after them. But she slipped and scraped her elbow. David's father picked her up and held her. And then he put a giant bandage on her elbow. And Julie said, "Well, David, you have a very nice father after all, but he is still kind of scary." "You think he's scary," said David. "Wait till you meet my grandmother." Great story. Has it ever happened to you where you thought that somebody was a big, scary, to-be-avoided giant, and in fact, they ended up showing you that they were the exact opposite? Blaze, where are you? Come up here. I want to tell you a story. You can sit there. Did you like that story? You've read it like 6 times, you told me. Yeah. When I was your age, how old are you? 7. Okay, now I wasn't even your age. I think I was 5 and a half, maybe 6. And I was playing with a boy who was my age, who lived on the other side of our house. We had a house, 2 houses stuck together. And I was playing with this boy, and I cut my finger one day. Look at my finger. See this? See the whole extra chunk? It looks like there's a cut all the way. I cut the whole tip of my finger off. Yeah, I know. My wife hates it. She thinks it's ugly. A deformed finger. I cut my whole fingertip off, and I was scared, and I was crying, and then all of a sudden, the dad of the boy heard me crying, and he came out of the house, and I was really scared of this man, because when he yelled at his son and got angry, he got really angry, and when he yelled to call him in for dinner, he always sounded really angry, so I thought this man was a real mean man, and this man took me into his house, and I wasn't worried about my finger anymore, I was worried about his house. And it had different curtains and different table, and it smelled different, and it sounded different. He had an accent, and he took me into his house, and I didn't know what he was going to do. And he took me over to the sink, and he washed some of the metal that was in the cut out, and then he took a big bandage, and he wrapped it around my finger, and then he carried me, because I was so sad, over to my mom and dad's house and brought me home. Great story, eh? Somebody ever taken care of you like that? Yeah. Okay, that's it. Off you go. This man who did not know me as a child carried me and took care of me. Sometimes we, and this is all of us, not just kids, are afraid of people we do not know. People of different religions, or no religion. Church is notorious for that. People with different colored skin, or who eat different kinds of foods, whose houses smell different around dinner time. People who are disabled, or in some way disfigured. People with different gender issues and different sexual orientations. People who have different political persuasions, people who live on the street who are very, very poor. That scares some people. I've learned over the last few years, people who are very, very rich, those giants scare some people as well. And the thought hit me this week, reading this book and thinking about why. I think we're afraid because we're insecure. We don't know who we are, and because we don't know who we are is so big a part of us, when we encounter difference, we don't know what to do with it. We see it as threatening because we're still not sure who we are, and so we can't quite handle how different that person, place, or thing is from us. And sometimes those differences get made into monsters. Now, that's pretty normal for little kids to do because they're still trying to figure out who they are, and they are insecure in a way, and they don't know their way in the world. But for us adults, the hope would be that maturity would lead to a self-understanding that would give us a secure place from which to accept the differences of other people. And this is true, I've noticed over the last few decades. The more you know who you are, the more you can handle someone who's quite different from you. Jesus was really good at accepting difference. He hung around with people who were called lepers. They suffered from something called Hansen's disease, which kills nerve endings and ends up causing all kinds of deformity and loss of limb and fingers and noses in those who suffer from it. Back in the day, they were ostracized. They lived in their own camps and places, and Jesus actually touched people with leprosy. He talked to a woman who a rabbi would normally not talk to, who was a Samaritan, who a rabbi would definitely not talk to, people from another tribe. He hung around with tax collectors, people who had given their allegiance to the Roman Empire that was occupying their people, were traitors, and Jesus extended a hand to them. Prostitutes, the uneducated fishermen that he hung with, and a lot of different sinners. And he told stories about a kingdom of God that elevated characters like Samaritans. The story of the Good Samaritan is about somebody from the wrong side of the tracks showing everybody else what it means to be a good neighbor. The story of the prodigal son is about a loser disrespecting wine, women, and song, blowing the family estate kid, who then gets accepted by the Father, not rejected and ostracized, made into a monster, his choices, but instead is accepted back by the Father. Stories, parables about lazy workers and crooked managers and poor broken souls that are taken up into the bosom of Abraham and into heaven. A lawyer once asked Jesus, "Teacher, what must I do to get eternal life?" And Jesus answered, What's written in God's law? How do you interpret it?" And the lawyer said, "That you love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as well as you do yourself." "Good answer," said Jesus. "Do it and you'll live. Love your neighbor as yourself." How can you ever love another human being if you've made them into a stereotype, or because of your biases or fears, turned them into giants or monsters? If you are ignorant of who they really are and don't know them, how can you love them? Some people, Jesus' disciples, struggled with that very question. And Peter was one of them. And Jesus was Jewish, and Peter was Jewish, and they shared this big Jewish tradition and religious past together, and they had a relationship with God, and they were God's people, and they had God's law. And because he was Jewish, and they were Jewish, Peter, not Jesus, was afraid of people who were outside of their religion. In fact, they were told to not hang with certain people. They were told that some people were unclean. And they had all of these dietary laws about what was clean and unclean and what they could eat and what they couldn't eat. And they would never eat with people who are eating unclean things. They wouldn't even hang around with them. And one day Peter, waiting on lunch, falls into a trance and has a vision, a God-given vision about the truth with regards to the thing he's struggling with, this issue. And in the vision, a big white sheet comes down from heaven and opens up, and it's filled with all of these animals that a good Jewish person would never eat because they weren't kosher. And the person in the vision says to Peter, God says to Peter, "Get up and eat." Peter goes, no, I'm Jewish, I would never eat that. Those aren't kosher. And the voice says, do not call unclean what God has made clean. And the vision, because Peter was a bit thick, was repeated 3 times. Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. And then Peter went on to discover that God wasn't just referring to food, he was referring to people. A few verses later, talking to a crowd of Roman people, not Jewish people, Peter said this. He says, you know, I'm sure that this is highly irregular. Jews don't do this, visit and relax with people of another race, but God has just shown me that no race is better than any other. And then a few verses later, it's God's own truth, he says. Nothing could be plainer. God plays no favorites. It makes no difference who you are or where you're from. If you want God and are ready to do as he says, the door is open. And then he goes on to tell them about Jesus and his life and his death and his resurrection and grace and love and forgiveness and mercy and having their eyes opened and their ears unstopped so they could see God everywhere. And then after he preaches his little sermon to these outsiders, the Holy Spirit of God descends on the place and fills the room and opens people's eyes and hearts and minds and ears and softens them. And through that act, it's as if God is saying yes to what Peter just said. I play no favorites. I play no favorites. Jesus said, it's who you are and the way you live that count before God. Your worship to the Samaritan woman, your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. That's the kind of people the Father is out looking for, those who are simply and honestly themselves before him in their worship. God made every single human being of all colors, orientations, shapes, sizes, levels of disability and ability, rich, poor, every single one of you in his image. God made you in your shape and size with that face and those legs and that way of viewing the world and those aptitudes and abilities. And through the love and forgiveness and grace of Christ, God sees you in all of your diversity as whole and holy and made new and perfect and just right when you're clothed with Christ. Listen to how Robert Munsch describes why he wrote the book David's Father. David's father had a very strange beginning. I made this up soon after we adopted our second child. Her name was Julie, and she was 5.5 years old when we got her. Every night I would tell Julie stories before she went to bed, and David's Father was the longest-running bedtime story ever. I told this story every night for 4 months, and Julie kept changing it and asking for different things. She put in all the things that interested her. She wanted to have a little girl who was afraid to go to school because she was afraid of meeting strange people and being kidnapped. She wanted to have a father who didn't look at all like the child who was adopted because she was brown and I was white. She told it, so I told it and told it and told it and told it. It was her very own story, and I didn't tell it to anybody else for a long time. And then one day, a couple of years later, I was in the middle of storytelling to lots of people, and I said, hey, I wonder if David's father, that story would work. And so I tried it out, and it did. Like, who of us isn't that 5.5-year-old girl even now, right? Trying to know you fit, and that you're okay, and that you're part of it, and you're included, and you don't have to be afraid, because we're all afraid. And how beautiful that a writer father, wish we all had one of those, would make up a story to help her find her way. Imagine this little girl, all her fears. And how beautiful that your Father would write into history such a beautiful story so that you can know in your fear and insecurity that you do have a place and that you do belong. And there is someone who will watch over you, and in fact has been doing it all your life, and says, "You're mine, you belong to me. I'll keep you, I'll protect you, I'll feed you, I'll watch over you, I'll keep you safe." The Father who shows us that you don't have to be afraid. From the prophet Isaiah, chapter 43. Don't be afraid. I've redeemed you. I've called your name, you're mine. When you're in over your head, I'll be there with you. When you're in rough waters, you will not go down. When you're between a rock and a hard place and can't see any possible way of getting across the street, it won't be a dead end, because I am God, your personal God. I paid a huge price for you. That's how much you mean to me. That's how much I love you. I'd sell off the whole world to get you back. Trade the creation just for you. So don't be afraid. I'm with you. I'll round up all your scattered children, pull them in from east and west. I'll send orders north and south. Send them back. Return my sons from distant lands, my daughters from faraway places. I want them back. Every last one who bears my name, every man, woman, and child, whom I created for my glory, yes, personally formed and made each one. Yes, God says, I am God. I've always been God, and I always will be God. No one can take anything from me. I make. Who can unmake it? He wrote the story. Who's going to retell it? He made you. He's the only one who can remake you. So what are you afraid of?